Thank you, James. Thank you, Jeffrey. And thank you, Karun, for getting me here. And for all that you've done to help along the way. I can't tell you, I'm so excited to be back here. I tell people, I'm going to Hornby Island, I can't wait. And they go, where? And I say, never mind. So, the talk that I'm going to give today is obviously about Jeffery Rubinoff's early work, specifically the early welded works, which I'll touch on briefly, Series 1 and Series 2. But I'm just beginning with a few general slides and I've tried to label everything so that would be easy. Although I see that I didn't change the type from black to white for Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty, but hopefully everyone knows it. That's Robert. So I don't need to tell you what everything is because everything's labeled. So we used to know what the term sculpture meant. Figural or abstract, sculpture was about volume in space. The predictable and limited definition was essentially upended and revolutionized in the 1960s and 70s. That's when we have an explosion of installations, buildings, landscapes, performances, photographs, films, all of which said, we are sculpture now. And people go, well, why on earth is this sculpture? Well, by the end of the 70s, the situation was totally out of hand. And Rosalind Krauss at that time wrote a seminal essay called Sculpture in the Expanded Field and said that sculpture as a category was now almost infinitely malleable. So then what the hell is sculpture? So Jeffery Rubinoff was in his early 30s and was obviously front and center as part of the whole maelstrom, was beginning to commit himself to art. Correct me if I'm wrong. He was not interested in these prevailing postmodern tendencies. He looked back instead. So he loved Donatello, Michelangelo, Rodin, the great expressive masters of sculptural objects. But his greatest inspiration was, without doubt, the American abstract expressionist artist David Smith. David Smith died in 1965, so just a little while earlier. He was 69. It was from a car accident on his way back home to Bolton Landing, where he lived near Lake George in the southern Adirondacks, from giving a lecture at Bennington College, which was in southern Vermont. Rubinoff's early work, which is made between 1969 and 1983, is dominated by welded steel sculptures, and they really reveal a debt to Smith. That's where he starts. And so in order to understand the work, we have to understand what did he get from Smith, why Smith was important to him, and what was the dialogue that went on, hopefully, in Jeffrey's mind and work. But before we look at Smith's career and at Jeffrey's, just want to talk about some reasons why Rubinoff was drawn to Smith. And there are 5 important ideas I just want to highlight, and I want to mention them now so that you have an idea where we're going. First, Smith was an abstract expressionist sculptor, contemporary with painters like Jackson Pollock. Of course, there were other sculptors, but he was the leader and the one who most profoundly explored welded metal sculpture in the United States. David Smith embraced the symbolism of iron and steel as modern emblems of violence and modern industrial society. Smith also pioneered the practice of working in extended series. Smith also did something that was very unusual. He embraced both abstraction and its place in the natural world. And finally, Smith chose to live and work in upstate New York, far from the mainstream art world in New York City. But let's go back for a minute. So this picture is of David Smith looking over the field at Bolton Landing. So you can see the mountainous landscape behind and the roll of the fields. And he kept most of his sculpture, and he, as he would say, he planted them in the fields. But we're going back in time now. I love this picture. He is arguably the most important sculptor in 20th century America. He was raised in the Midwest, our industrial and agricultural heartland. He credited his father, who worked for the phone company and was a part-time inventor, and his grandfather, a blacksmith, as artistic ancestors, along with all sorts of diverse influences, including railway cars and a brief summer job on a Studebaker assembly line where he learned spot welding. So I was very happy to find this picture of a Studebaker plant and a car, so you had an idea of what that car might have looked like. So then he moves to the big city. He gets a job with a bank, 1927, but he really wants to be an artist. Now, how on earth does someone from the middle of nowhere sort of decide he wants to be an artist? He hadn't seen much art, except for, reportedly, in his grandmother's Bible. But he wants to be a painter. He got this in his head. So he moves to New York. He gets a room in a rooming house, and he meets another painter, a young lady, Dorothy Daner. She says, oh, well, if you want to be an artist, you come with me. We're going to go to the Art Students League. So he does. And this is his new life. He marries her within a year, and then he was off and running. He quits the bank, obviously, and he does everything from working for Spalding to driving a cab, all sorts of stuff. And he is now part of the new community of artists. On the bottom, that is the actual Art Students League building. On the top, that's the area near where he was living. It's basically the Upper West Side near Columbia in 1927, and that is Smith and Daner, a beautiful little picture from 1928. In 1932, Smith's looking through a French magazine. Of course, he can't read French, so he just looks at the pictures about Picasso, and he sees photographs of a recent sculpture Picasso made with the help of his friend Julio Gonzalez, and one of the pieces is like the one on the left. And that's a model for Picasso's proposed monument to his friend Apollinaire, the poet, who had died in 1918. And when he was thinking about what to do, he was inspired actually by Apollinaire's own writing, where at the end of a short story, Apollinaire had said, how do you make a monument to a poet? And the answer is basically you have to make something out of nothing. And so that was the inspiration for this revolutionary transparent sculpture that Picasso went on to make, which looks like a line drawing in space. The joints were actually welded by his friend Gonzalez, who Picasso called on because he knew he had worked in an auto plant and knew how to weld, and was also a sculptor himself. So Picasso made this new kind of sculpture that's essentially transparent. Welding made it possible to join pieces with much greater freedom than any other means, essentially making 3D collage that we now call assemblage. Smith grasped the implications of this radical new approach, which ironically, after this period of welding for Picasso between 28 and 29, 28 and 30, he just drops entirely. He just moves on, but Smith stayed with it, and essentially it was the seed for his entire career. In the middle, that's just a very early welded work that shows the familiar relationship to Picasso, and that's a beautiful picture, I think, of Smith welding around 1940. So here's his studio. So Smith developed this new craft not in a traditional artist studio, but in a workshop that he set up inside a commercial welding business called Terminal Iron Works on the Brooklyn waterfront. So he would do things like go out with the guys on boats and on their boats, and sometimes make some money, help them out. They thought he was nuts. Who is this guy? They'd never heard of art being made in this way, and neither did anyone else. Years later, he reestablished and expanded the factory-style studio at Bolton Landing in upstate New York. But what did he do during the war? What'd you do during the war, Daddy? Oh, I made tanks. So that's him on the upper left actually welding a tank. So he became a master welder officially during the Second World War. He welded locomotives and M7 armored tanks for the American Locomotive Company from 1942 to 1944 in Schenectady, New York, which is near Albany, and he actually moved there left Bolton Landing, moved to an apartment there with Dorothy Dana. She wasn't very happy. For Smith, welding steel was more than just joining metal. There was something wonderfully subversive about taking the material of war and using it to make art, turning violence into beauty. The potential, though, for violence and its association with steel was never far from his mind, especially in the years just around World War II. All three of these works were made in 1945. In 1945, he unleashed a barrage of aggressive, nightmarish compositions, including a number that melded contemporary events with prehistoric imagery, and even made cast bronze figures, that's on the lower right, that analogize the horrors of wartime rape and destruction. When the intensity of the immediate post-war years waned, Smith mastered the illusion of presenting large welded steel assemblages as graceful graphic lines. Now he's working on a scale that parallels that of the abstract expressionist artists. He literally invented the idea that you could make a sculptural image of a landscape. He never stopped pressuring those divisions that had been established between the 2- and 3-dimensional arts. His last monumental sculptures from 1965 were made using large flat steel plates, ground characteristically by this time with a circular sander, which created an electrifying linear imprint. The bold new structures looked as much like painting as sculpture. So Smith pushed sculpture out of the studio, out of the past, ignoring traditional divisions and hierarchies between painting and sculpture, and ignited an aesthetic revolution. After his death, he was honored with many museum retrospectives. Yet many emerging artists at the time were reluctant to follow his lead. They wanted to go somewhere else. Maybe they felt this work wasn't relevant, welding wasn't radical anymore, or his legacy was linked too closely to the European modernists that they were trying to get away from. Rubinoff, however, was compelled to confront Smith's legacy, and aren't we lucky? In the winter of 1968, Jeffery Rubinoff was in Oklahoma, and a fellow graduate student showed him how to weld. He was absolutely starstruck, so to speak, embracing the torch, loved the touch, the feel, the sight, even the sparks that flew when the flame hit the metal. No, that's not him, but I like the picture. So we're looking here at a couple of Jeff's early work. So EW-2 and 3, EW stands for early work. Each of these compositions features an integrated tetrahedron and a free-flowing biomorphic abstraction cut from a piece of sheet metal joined to a rectilinear framework. Did you get that? Elements refer to tables, beams, and other common construction elements. He just got his MFA from the University of Oklahoma. And what did he do? He went back to Toronto, where he made his first group of welded sculptures, and that's between 1969 and 71. These works are clearly linked through material and repeated formal elements, but they weren't a series. Each one was considered separate and independent. They were developed spontaneously, without any preliminary drawings, and they were rooted in surrealist-inspired visual poetry. He developed the compositions so that we are rewarded with a series of changing, even conflicting images when we walk around the pieces. One view does not predict the next. That's actually a visual concept that David Smith was also famous for exploring and exploiting. These sculptures were originally painted bright colors, and I wish I could have seen them because I'm so curious and there are no pictures. In the 1980s, when they were returned to Hornby Island, Jeffrey decided to sandblast them. So this is what we have, and I think they're wonderful, but I'm so curious about those colors. The early welded works were a success. Rubinoff had a solo show in February 1971 at the Maslow Gallery in Toronto, followed soon by a second exhibition at the Ontario Science Centre, so you'd think this guy's off and running. But no, Rubinoff was disappointed with the market realities because he was told that only small works were going to sell. In his opinion, I was to be condemned to the production of tchotchkes. His larger structures were returned unsold. Continuing in this way was going to be guaranteed frustration and unfulfillment. He would be tied to a system that did not feed the artistic soul that he had. The end of the 1970s meant that two things had changed. One, he actually had money. He would be financially self-sufficient thanks to a commercial construction project we'll learn about later that had occupied much of his time between 1970 and 72. And second was the discovery of the work of David Smith. That's what we're looking at here. Before 1978, Rubinoff's aesthetic allegiances were diverse. He was interested in all sorts of stuff, as we've already seen. But his interest in David Smith before this time was sort of distant and vague, sort of out here. But that changed. In the winter of 1978, when Rubinoff was in Los Angeles and visited the Franklin D. Murphy Sculpture Garden at UCLA and literally stumbled on Smith's stainless steel Cubi 20, which was made in 1964. Smith's abstract tabletop work changed with every step. Dynamically sanded gestural surface comes alive and kept changing with every change in the ambient light. The elements welded to the table are angled towards the inside, seemingly protective of an invisible interior space, while the central core has an oddly spiritual or ritual feeling about it. Rubinoff was entranced by this work and its gravitational push-pull. It reignited his love of object making and inspired him. It's a new starting point for his life as an artist. So he decided that he was going to learn by emulating David Smith. He's not going to retreat or reject history. He wants to be measured in relation to it. So returning to work as a sculptor, he chose steel as his medium, but this time for its symbolic power as much as for its physical strength. In addition, he did embrace the material association with military aggression. He saw steel as the metaphor of America's rise to power, due in part to its role in developing railroads as the horizontal ribbons that united the country. That's actually a map of the U.S. rail system. And steel mills that define much of our nation's economy, our being me, the only American here, I think. Of course, having spent a period of 1970s as a developer, Rubinoff had an unusual first-hand understanding of the power and importance of steel in construction, allowing builders to move beyond the limitations of stone and create ever taller structures. Yet Rubinoff was also sensitive, like Smith before him, to the links between steel, tanks, and bombers. The material itself became a vessel for his concerns about humanity's increasingly susceptibility to aerial warfare. But rather than expressing these modern-day anxieties literally, as many artists have done, he insisted on working abstractly. In this case, his own written statements are essential to understanding this intention. Art making in steel became somewhat ironically a metaphor for our current state of anxiety and vulnerability. So here we are, finally, at Series 1. And I love looking at it on the screen and then turning and looking at it outside. So Series 1 includes 8 sculptures in 1981 and 1982. That's 1/6, 1/4, and 1/5 in that order. So this is a series, states right there in the title. With his choice of material settled, Rubinoff had to decide how to proceed. Until 1980, we've seen his sculpture had a kind of family relationship because he worked on various pieces at the same time. Now he's starting to work in series. Now we have a whole new set of questions. So I'm doing a series. How's it going to evolve? What's the subject going to be? And how am I going to know when it's done? These are both examples of David Smith. Oh, shit, I can't go back. That's all right. Rubinoff once again turned to David Smith's example for guidance, because since 1951 he'd worked in extended series, some of which developed over more than a decade. Sometimes a series was based on a material like the slide we just saw, which is the Agricola series, in which each work incorporated a discarded farm implement. Then there are the tank totems. Those are the left and right pieces here are both tank totems, and the photographs are taken on the dock overlooking Lake George. In the tank totems, each one incorporates part of a boiler tank top. He ordered these boiler tank tops and incorporated them into works, although not every work with a boiler tank top element was actually a tank totem. And he did it over the course of that series, went 10 years. Most relevant to Smith's early work were the cubis that Smith made starting in 1961 and continued to 1965. That name was invented by Smith to describe the compositions based on his welded cubes and other prismatic volumes. So you can see at a glance the connection. So here is the first in the series. The change in Rubinoff's methodology marked a significant change in his process. Instead of working on many works at the same time, he's focusing intensely on one sculpture at a time. So he's starting to work systematically, establishing for himself markers by which he could measure changes from one work to the next, and it would be a conversation as he progressed. So he's not in the commercial art market right now at this point, and he didn't have any commercial or external structures to evaluate his development. So he needed these formal constraints, supposedly because they helped him avoid getting stuck in one style and also encouraged him to explore formal questions more deeply, much like a composer elaborating a theme or a phrase through successive variations. I also think that's a very contemporary viewpoint at that time. Makes me think about Sol LeWitt, who would also develop systematically, only it's done in a totally different vocabulary. Even though there isn't a direct relationship, it's another way in which Rubinoff straddles what he's learning about David Smith, who's rooted in previous dimension, and still living in a contemporary world. David Smith's cubi were planned using leftover liquor boxes in his basement. Rubinoff was actually initially inspired by a set of children's blocks, so you use what's around. He ordered stainless steel panels and welded the prismatic volumes in his barn. The new shapes were joined spontaneously and intuitively into new compositions. Let's look at this one. It's a raised table. The arrangement is composed of 6 cubic volumes. The cantilevered support for the table creates visual tension and draws our attention to the strength of the supporting weld. The table itself suggests some sort of mysterious ritual setting. The broad diamond set on point has another element leaning against its side. It's not self-supporting, but a fiction, an image of improbable, precarious balance. And this is a photograph actually taken by Jeffery. Why this one seems to have a different kind of emphasis to me and includes a focus on that vertical rectangle that stands apart from the rest of the piece. Is that a base for an invisible work? Is it a truncated body part? The photograph suggests that he used it to integrate the surrounding space into the work, insisting on its relationship to the whole and stressing the spatial gap between it and the central arrangement of forms. Is this where Rubinoff sits in relation to the art world? Is it a symbolic representation of the artist on Hornby Island set apart from the mainstream? Well, maybe that's taking it too far. But I like the way that it energizes that space between the top of that rectangle and the table and enlarges its parameters. So that's the David Smith cubi on the right. So at first glance, this and other works seem derivative of Smith's cubis. Rubinoff saw them as a way of learning, as homages. And this way of learning, by emulating someone else's style, is a time-honored way of becoming an artist. Gorky had done it recently. Rembrandt did it. Everybody did it. So he came close to Smith's model, and he diverged from it. The simple cubic volumes, the precarious balance, the sanded surfaces reflecting ambient light, yes, these are all dependent on Smith's example. But while Smith retained a connection to the physical world, to figuration essentially, Rubinoff was resolutely abstract. Rubinoff also has very different ideas about surface, one that is about time and in this way seems very contemporary. He lets his surface be overrun by algae, lichen, mold, and all sorts of growths, things that seem peculiar in a way because they degrade the reflective surface that marks the sculpture's initial phase. But this connection to the natural world adds a vital and unique dimension to the compositions. Now, this was not in my paper and something I was just thinking about and James and I had not talked about this. So when he just had this in his introduction, I thought, oh, cool. So this is series 1, number 2, and I like this compact twist in the second work. It's as if Rubinoff wanted to see what happens when you take away the pedestal and just work with the arrangement on the top that circulates around an open central space. When viewed in the context of the series, it's more than a compact abstraction. It's a question, an experiment, a thesis, an idea in physical form. Each work in Series 1 is part of a what-if scenario, like a scientific hypothesis. What if the elements stay the same except one? How will that single change affect the end product? What if the T is removed and the sculpture ascends directly from the ground? What if the larger rectangle forms are replaced with a cascade of small cubes? It was with Series 1 that Rubinoff developed the foundation of his incremental sequential sculptural practice. And while this method was inspired by David Smith, Rubinoff developed it in a distinctly personal manner. Soon, Rubinoff increased the number of elements from 6 to 11, setting himself something of a challenge. So Series 1, 1-3, 1-4, and 1-5 are each based on a central T structure, topped by an open space punctuated by cubic volumes of various sizes, some elongated rectangles and other smaller cubes. He maintained the cantilevered sense of precariousness so that a work like Series 1, number 3 also reminds me of the Cat in the Hat juggling. My mother said, no. So here we have Series 1, number 5, and then the 2 David Smiths. That's Cubi 1 and Cubi 20. Although I inverted the label, sorry about that. And Cubi 1 is 1963. It's not actually the first made, but it doesn't matter. So each of these features one or more cubes on point, which seems to reference the David Smith cubis. Rubinoff's arrangement is complicated. It needed a cross piece to stabilize the composition. One piece touches another only at the most minimal points except the base, which is in direct contact with the ground. Already, Rubinoff is using modules in different combinations and in this sense reveals another connection to 1960s minimalist abstraction, which is very different from Smith's largely figure-based vision. Series 1 ended with a dramatic 10-foot-high tumble of blocks and cubes that were essentially raised off the ground on 2 separate T-shapes. Open in the middle, turning in space, the sculpture pulls in the viewer, rewarded by walking around with a series of interesting views as spaces open and close to the surrounding landscape which it frames. By the end of 1981, Rubinoff decided he was done with Series 1, but how did he know it was finished? This is a question that recurs through the history of modernism, especially with the turn to abstraction and to compositions that lack traditional guidelines by which we judge finish. This was a major consideration that was discussed with great gusto by the abstract expressionist artists. They would argue about how do you know what the subject is, how do you know when you're done, all these things that are caused a lot of, I think, knockdown, drag-out fights and are difficult to decide answers to when you're not representing something that's external. In this case, Rubinoff was satisfied with the permutations he'd worked out through an external set of variables. The subject, however, this is really important, it wasn't exhausted. It was just nearing the end. He said, I knew a series was finished when I was sure there was only one more piece in the series. This piece would not be built. I fear that I would hate it because it would lead nowhere. What next? The end of Series 1 in 1981 provided a point of reflection. Rubinoff had completed a series in which one piece flowed naturally into the next, like stones in a riverbed. He'd worked through the seasons. He'd established his working presence and his life on the farm at Hornby Island. He created the studio, discovered his rhythms, and a new environment. So when a series is done, there's often anxiety about what you do next. Me, I clean up the room. I put things away. But do you have confidence in what that next step is going to be? Is it going to be as good as what you just did? So, and what do? You analyze what you did. So Rubinoff did just that, and he said, there's a problem with Series 1. What's the problem? No, it's not that he was too close to David Smith. That was something of an accomplishment. No, he said the volumes were too dense, and they actually looked too much like carved stone. Instead of referencing the modern industrial complex that he wanted to, he said the sculptures felt like they referenced the art and history of Rome, and that's a culture that to him represented compression, suppression, and repression. So he wanted to get away from that to express something else entirely. So he's ready to move on. What does that mean? Well, he's still waiting for the art market to return to its senses, which it never did. And how about the work? Was it going to just remain on Hornby? Was it going to be sold? He had no idea. If it's sold, would the collector be a proper guardian? Sending pieces out to exhibitions was like a trauma, like losing a tooth. Perhaps, like Smith, he decided he couldn't or didn't want to part with them, which are all part of a whole. The objects he brought to life on Hornby had become an integral part of his physical and spiritual landscape. Still, this utopian life was coexisting with the dream of recognition in the traditional sense. And until 1998, he still kind of hoped he might get to work out some exhibitions, and he had a gallery, but then that was closed by 98, and that was the end of Jeffery and the art market. At that point, he decided to focus his energy entirely on this land and the sculpture. He chose to develop the environment he could control and develop the relation between sculptures and the land, really modeled on Smith's example. 1982, he starts his second sculptural series, which is 5 works and occupied him for more than a year. This time, he was concerned with steel, but as a metaphor for strength and progress. He uses the steel in Series 2, and that's Series 2 right in the center there, that's number 1, to reference the world of construction, which he had been so involved with in the 70s. His forms now allude to structural armatures, the type that enabled modern buildings to rise to huge heights. The scale increases, and the formal language moves beyond the stacked and balanced cubes to assemblages of slender cylindrical pipes and large, oversized ratchets. Tubes and ductwork. This is Series 2, number 1. Tubes and ductwork dominate Series 2. They're metaphoric carriers of ideas now and about flowing communication. The first of the group even recalls a basement filled with ductwork or a jungle gym rather than a set of blocks. Previous works typically had this peaked upper structure, which was open at the center, and this composition is more diagrammatic and cubic in its contours. This tubing looks like thickly drawn lines. They intersect at the center with that thicker central steel plate. Open space is prominent, but maybe a little less well-defined. Here, the artist is taking a risk, heading in an uncharted direction, intentionally moving away from the Cubi-inflected work of just the previous year. Yes, this work also has an alternate title, another part of an experiment. It refers to a nearby island, Galiano number 1. So he experimented with adding this Spanish-named island to the title, but that was just temporary. He ultimately decided that it was best to maintain a neutral chronological system of identification. The second work shares little in common with the first. He returned to a peaked open structure. There are only 4 elements. It's elegant and resolved in contrast with the predecessor. And the third, made at the end of 82, is audacious, comprising linked segments of robotic-style piston arms, reaching, twisting, and tautly arranged, ultimately forming an open circular composition. Voids are vital to these compositions. It actually calls to mind Smith's Open Gates that he did at the end of the Cubi series in 1965. That's Cubi 27. Series 2, number 4, was begun in 83. It's a monumental effort to extend this spatial and formal vocabulary. It's 10 feet high, spans 15 feet, and 9 feet. It's a very large sculpture intended to challenge its surrounding, operating on the same scale maybe as a monumental work by Marc de Suvro. Look, it's practically as tall as the trees. So Rubinoff took time, literally, to grow into the environment where he settled. He got comfortable with it, was finally able to embrace its challenges, the scale and the light. He developed the maturity and bravado to pit his creation against the spectacle of natural beauty in a kind of philosophical wrestling match in which neither side will be subdued. This relationship between him, the artist, his art, and nature would become central to Rubinoff's achievement on Hornby Island. These works also invite passage from one side to the other and also seem to refer back to the arch which stands at the entrance to the White Oaks Mall, which we'll be learning about later. Well, this is the end of Series 2. It's a more modest, taut, and intriguing work. It has only 3 main lines: vertical, oblique, and horizontal. It's a return to human scale. It's approachable and has distilled his efforts into a powerful and compact visual statement. With this achievement, the second series is complete and points in new directions. And that's going to be towards Series 3, which James will speak about. And so that's the end, officially, of Jeffrey's early work. But there are a few other things I just want to talk about. Ultimately, it's our direct confrontation with Rubinoff's sculpture, sited and installed in the sculpture park here, that's important. And these are some questions we always need to ask. Does it frame our view? In what way? How is one work related to another and the natural forms around it? Should we walk around it, through it, or both? And how does walking under and through the sculpture compare to our experience walking in and among the surrounding tall pine trees? Rubinoff learned early that his abstractions could heighten our experience of the land, and its environment, and of the art itself. The setting invites a contrast and a discussion about the relation between art and nature, steel and the wood of trees, twists and turns of streams along the ground. From this point forward, Rubinoff will change course, and we'll see that, of course. But what does one make of the first 2 series? He studied balance, the relationship of elements at a large scale to each other and to nature. He had come to see how his abstract steel sculptures could inhabit the universe at Hornby. He steeped himself in the mantle of David Smith, chosen as a model for his achievement and status, but it was only the beginning, a point of entry for an artistic body of work that would unfold over several decades. Each of work in the series evolved from an ongoing private dialogue, a kind of call and response with past, present, and future. This approach, which began with Series 1 and 2, had to be tested and took time to clarify. So Rubinoff, even at this early stage, asked how was he going to measure progress? How could he figure out if he was successful? If success was measured by sales, then David Smith was a failure. And this is David Smith's field in 1962. When he died, most of his work remained in his possession. He was ambivalent about selling and often took measures to ensure that sculptures he created never left Bolton Landing during his lifetime by placing insanely high prices on them. When asked in 1964 why he made work so big, he responded by saying he did this knowing no collector would buy them. No one would separate the created from the creator. Rubinoff has adopted an uncannily similar attitude. Working in isolation, he too has rejected commercial imperatives of the art market to such an extent that he's bought back some works he originally sold. He fully expects to retain 95% of the work. In fact, it's this fact that really motivated him to create the sculpture park, his sort of answer to Bolton Landing, an ideal setting that he has created for his sculpture. By 1983, he had absorbed the lessons of modernism, largely filtered through Smith's example, and began to move forward on his own terms. So Smith was a portal for the younger artist, a door he passed through on the way to defining the breadth of his own voice. During these vital years, he identified with the older artists for reasons that extend beyond material and process. Smith also cherished solitude, the rhythms of nature, listening to classical music, reading great literature, philosophy and history, and debating current affairs. For both men, art was a necessity, a primal need, an expression of identity. Indeed, Rubinoff's commitment to this new life as an artist here on Hornby Island is a reminder of Smith's own words that Rubinoff surely knows because he has his own treasured copy of David Smith by David Smith. If you ask me why I make sculpture, I must answer it as my way of life, my balance, my justification for being. Thank you, Jeffrey.